Hi, my name is Jamad Canley, and I'm the president and CEO of Potential Unleashed Consulting. And also, I'm one of your virtual guides as you make your way through this course around cultural competency and diversity, equity, inclusion. As we get started on this journey, I wanted to give you a set of tools, a framework, if you will, that we call both and lenses. As we navigate the ways of diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency, oftentimes it can push people into either or thinking. And so, what we like to do is present these both and lenses as a separate antidote to either or thinking. Because so often the answers, the solutions, and the way to engage in this work isn't an either or, but it truly is a both and. It helps us to recognize that people are not either this or that, but people can be both at the same time. And so, as I share these with you, I'll move through the both and lenses four at a time, give you some time to process those, and then give you the next four. But again, these will serve not only as some great content, but really as a tool set as you move through each module for you to think about and process this information through. The first both and lens that we like to share is called intent and impact. Intent and impact. So often when we engage in this work, it's really important for us to not only recognize, but to own our intent. And I think most people do that really well. I'll just speak from myself. I know that I do that really well. And so if I make a mistake or if I accidentally hurt someone's feelings, just in life in general, I'm really quick to own and acknowledge my intent. And I'll say to people, I'm so sorry, that wasn't my intent. That's not how I meant it, or I apologize. And that's a really good step. But if we truly want to engage in this work around equity and cultural competency and diversity and inclusion, not only do we want to think about and recognize and own our intent, but to also recognize and acknowledge our impact. It's owning our intent is a great first step. And again, we also want to look at the impact. Often in life, we do things with really good positive intent, but sometimes the intent and the impact do not match. So if people are hyper focused on intent, we ask them to start to think about the impact and to acknowledge the impact as well. I'll give an example in just a moment. But the flip side of that is to also think about impact, but also consider intent. Sometimes when someone says something or does something, or even if I'm looking at information or I'm reading something that can be really tough, it's really easy for me to only zone in on the impact and to go, I don't like this. I don't like how it made me feel. I don't really like, what that person is saying. And I'm really focused on the impact. But if I can stop and also consider the intent, it can help me actually move through that space much easier and faster and with a different perspective. I may not like the impact, but I can also consider the fact that the intent is not malicious, that the intent is to help me grow, that the intent is to stretch me. And so again, as I mentioned about being hyper focused on intent, we want people to consider impact, but if we become hyper focused on impact, we also want people to consider the intent. And sometimes we'll find that the intent, again, was very positive from the beginning. So here's a quick example on intent and impact. Let's say that I'm stretching one day. And I'm just stretching my arms out, and without me noticing, someone walks up from behind and bam, I hit them in the face. Definitely wasn't my intent. And I quickly go into acknowledging and apologizing and explaining my intent. I'm so sorry. I didn't see you standing there. I would have never intentionally hit you in the face. And that's a great step. But the person who's standing there bleeding, who is definitely feeling the impact, wants me to also acknowledge that. So I may start with my apology and explaining, I'm so sorry. That wasn't my intent. I didn't see you standing there. And I also see that you're bleeding. Let me get you a towel. Let me help you to, get some medical services. So intent and impact, holding on to both of those at the same time. The next one is difference and sameness. And so this lens starts off on the difference side. And what we believe with difference is that difference is beautiful. Difference is diversity, right? It makes the world go round. And we recognize that again, difference is kind of the spice of life. It's a beautiful thing. And there's harm when we get hyper focused on difference. When we become hyper focused on difference, it can be used to separate people. It promotes the idea that because we are so different, we can't possibly come together. Any ism that you find is deeply rooted in being hyper focused on difference. It promotes the idea that because we are different races, different genders, different ethnicities, that we can't possibly come together. And so a lot of people get that and they recognize, well, we don't want to become hyper focused on difference. And so they believe that the solution is then to become hyper focused on sameness. So let's talk about sameness. Again, sameness, much like difference within itself, is a beautiful, wonderful thing. What we believe and teach is that as people, as human beings, we have more in common than we have different. But we also recognize that when we become hyper focused on sameness, it leads us to no longer see any difference. And that becomes a very dangerous thing as well. See, sameness is great, and it's also okay at the same time to recognize difference. But when we become hyper focused on sameness, again, we erase the differences. And well, let's just talk about how that plays out. If you've ever heard anyone, or maybe we have said it ourselves, someone who says, I don't see color. Now, that often comes from a really good place. So it comes from good intent. But the impact of that says, I don't recognize that people experience this world differently. And that's the truth. People experience the world differently based off of height, based off of appearance, based off of race, based off of gender, based off of national origin, based off of geography. There's difference in the world. And it's okay to recognize the difference and to also acknowledge that based off of those differences, people do experience the world differently. We get where a lot of people are coming from when they make that comment. We've done a lot of research on this, and we found that a lot of people pick that up and that mindset up of, color blindness or only seeing sameness and no longer seeing gender and no longer seeing race. That again, it often, for a lot of people, it really became popular based off of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream, where he states that I have a dream that one day, and I'm paraphrasing here, my children wouldn't be judged based off of the color of their skin, but based off of the content of their character. And especially after the murder and the assassination of Dr. King, a lot of people said enough is enough. In order to make the dream come true, we will no longer see difference. But that's not what he asked. What he asked was that we wouldn't judge people based off of the difference. Again, when we ignore the difference, we ignore people's lived experiences. When we ignore differences, we deny part of people and who they are, and that their experiences in this world may look very different than mine. So again, wonderful intent, but the impact must also focus on the impact. So that's difference and sameness. The third lens, individual and group. I, Demad Canley, am an individual, just like all of us watching this right now. We're all individuals, and people like to be recognized for their individuality. And it's important to also recognize that we belong to multiple groups. Those watching this video belong to the group of educators. You might belong to the third grade group. You might belong to the group of a specific school building. You are the staff of ... And so though we also have group identities, it's important to recognize that we're also individuals. It's a both and. Sometimes it doesn't feel good to only be seen through your group identity. I'm sure some of us have experienced this when you've heard people speak about educators in a very general statement. And they'll say things like, well, they just want the summers off. And you've thought to yourself, whoa, 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 I'm not like that. And what you're really saying at that moment is, hey, even though I'm a member of that group, I want you to also recognize that I'm an individual. And so it's being able to hold both of those, right? And to also be able to distinguish between when people are speaking to your individual identity or your group identity. And sometimes this comes up in this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency, because there will be phrases and terms where people are sharing, for example, maybe around race. And it's important to recognize that even when someone says people of color or they say white people, that even though they're talking about a group identity, that there's multiple individuals inside of that group. And to only see people through a group identity is very lazy, and it can lead to a lot of harm. The other part of that, though, that we have found is that sometimes people struggle with group identities because they've been raised to see themselves as only individuals. Often, again, people who come from historically marginalized backgrounds have been raised to see themselves as both. So, historically marginalized, historically underrepresented backgrounds, people of color, uh, based off of gender, so women and others who are non cisgendered men, they've been raised to see themselves as both an individual and also recognizing that at the same time, they have a group identity that sometimes they'll be judged off of. It's important, again, to be able to hold both of those. One of my good friends, he is a police officer. He's actually a chief of police of a local police department here in Washington State. And we were having a conversation one time, and as we were discussing this very lens, I said, "So what's it like for you out there right now?" We were talking about all the things going on with law enforcement, and he said, "It's really difficult." He said, "And it's tough because I'm being judged based off of the actions of people who I've never even met simply because of the uniform that I wear." And I said to him, "I get it, and it's unfair. And there's millions of people who are experiencing that every day. And for some people, it's not because of the uniform that they wear, it's because of the skin that they were born in. It's because of the gender that they were born in. It's because of the country that they were born in, individual and group." Fourth one, whole and part. Long story short on this one, in order for this work to be scalable and sustainable, we must look at both and. We must look at doing this work holistically as a school, as a building, or as a district. But also, we must do this work in the individual parts. It's great for a team, let's say again, for an English department or a fifth grade team to really dive into this work of DEI and cultural competency. And that is a great thing. We need to figure out how to embed it into the part. But we also recognize that if this work is not done holistically, meaning that if we're not looking collectively as a school, as a system, as a district, at our practices, policies, procedures, and culture, the fifth grade team or the English team can do really great work, but it's often not scalable and sustainable. The reverse of that, again, is if the school, the district, the system begins to do this work, but we don't find ways to embed it into the individual parts, this work is also not scalable and sustainable. So it's the both and. What I would love for you to do right now is take a moment and just process out of those four lenses, which one is naturally speaking to you the most and or is challenging you the most. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, wow, I've got some work to do around intent and impact. Maybe it's that whole concept of difference and sameness because some of us, again, for very good intent, we were raised to not see difference. So that might be a challenge for some of us, but I'll put those back up and just take a moment to process which one is speaking to you the most and or which one is challenging you the most. Excellent. All right, let me give you these last four again to get you started on your journey. The next one is responsible, not my fault, or not my fault, responsible. We're going to start on the not my fault side. So it's really important as we engage in this work to recognize that none of us were alive in 1492 or 1619 or 1862, 63, 64, or 65. Meaning some of the historical systems of oppression that exist and that were created inside of North America and the United States, those aren't our fault. No one here needs to hang our head in blame and shame about things that happened years and years and years ago before we were ever born. We weren't a part of that system. We didn't vote for that system. We didn't create that system. So no one needs to hang our head in blame, shame, and guilt. And nowhere inside of this program will we ever promote that idea. It's not our fault. Myself, the fact that I experience male privilege, for example, it's not my fault. I didn't create the system of sexism. So I don't need to hang my head in shame about being a male in society. And I have a responsibility. Am I responsible for the past? No, not at all. But I have a responsibility to examine myself, to examine the system that I work in, to examine my practices, my policies, my procedures, to examine collectively our culture, to make sure that we are not unintentionally upholding some of those systems of oppression, of racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, and others. So holding on to both of those. I can tell you personally that one of the biggest barriers and enemies to this work is guilt. When people feel the guilt start to rise, they quickly want to shut down and lean away from the conversation. When we hold on to responsible, not my fault, I can hang in the conversation, recognizing that again, I'm not being blamed for things that have happened and systems that are still at play today. And I can also recognize that I have a responsibility for the present and for the future to make sure that we're doing all that we can to create cultures of equity and belonging. Responsible, not my fault. Key lens, hold on to that one. It'll definitely come in handy, like the others, but it will definitely come in handy as we get into some of the deeper conversations, especially around race. Next one is self-reflection and action. So for these two, I'll just put it this way. One without the other leads to danger and harm. If we run to action without self-reflection, we often end up in a really sticky place because we do things with really good intent, but we haven't fully considered the entire impact. And then on the flip side, sitting in self-reflection without taking action is also dangerous because it leads to stagnation, and people are being impacted by these things every single day. So we need both. We need to self-reflect and take action. Self-reflect and take action. And I'll give you one little quick tip. The work that you're engaging in this course is both. It's going to require some self-reflection, and you also are taking action. You're doing something. So many people are sitting back on the sidelines and just waiting to see what's going to happen, but you're actively engaging in work and challenging yourself. That's action. And part of that action is going to also be self-reflection. The seventh one here, challenge and support, is really about culture. And I'm just going to call this one out. So often right now in our culture, we have a hyper challenge culture. And so as a result, people are reluctant to engage in these conversations because in a hyper challenged culture, if you say the wrong thing, if you don't use the correct term, that's it. And so people have shared with me, Jamad, I'd rather not say anything at all. I'd rather not engage at all because I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to offend anyone. And I also don't want to be labeled as something that I'm not because of my ignorance on this topic. So I'd rather just not engage. That's what hyper challenge looks like. Hyper support, though, is also dangerous. So what does hyper support look like? Well, it's when we don't feel comfortable confronting someone because we really don't like confrontation. So without us even knowing it, if people are making comments or doing things that are leading to harm or separation or discrimination, things that we know are insensitive, things that we know actually block equity, sometimes we just don't feel comfortable stepping up and saying something. And so again, without us even knowing it, unintentionally, we end up actually supporting that behavior. Other times, it's because of our relationships. If I said something that was insensitive, some people would say, well, I know Jamad, he's a good guy. And therefore, I know that's not how he meant it. I won't say anything at all. If we truly want to build constructive cultures, especially around cultural competency, diversity, equity, inclusion, and just strong cultures in general. It's the balance and the both end of challenge and support. Here's what it might sound like. Hey, Jamad, I know this wasn't your intent, but this was the impact of what you said. See, what a person is doing at that time, they're calling me in versus calling me out. They're challenging, they're interrupting the behavior. Hey, Jamad, I know this may not have been your intent. So they're saying something, but they're also doing it in a way that provides support. I need to let you know that here was the impact. And the next time, you might want to think about saying it a different way. Got it. They've called me back into the work versus called me out. And then the last one, this lens I personally added in the summer of 2020. I was coaching a lot of people, and I could see that they were really struggling with what was happening in our country after the murder of George Floyd, the protests that were happening, and people were having a lot of conversations, and there was an awareness, a raised awareness of, systemic racism. And several people who I was coaching during this time were really struggling with a couple things. The idea that sometimes the people and the things that we love and find value in can also be flawed. One woman shared with me that, someone very close to her that she loved, who had done all of these wonderful, amazing things and had been this amazing person in her life, she recognized also makes really racist comments, has very racist tendencies. And she was trying to reconcile the two, because on one hand, this is this person who has meant so much to me and has accomplished all these wonderful things and has contributed to the community and has been, this pillar in my life. And yet I also recognize, gosh, they say some things that just aren't okay. And I shared with her this lens, valued and flawed. That person can hold extreme value in your life, and you can also recognize that on the topic of race, they're flawed. Another person, he's a retired Marine, is currently the CEO of a pretty large company here in the Northwest. He and I are having a conversation. He's always talking to me about how, the Corps has done so many great, wonderful things for him, and how he used those pillars that he learned in the Corps to really build his own life, but then also to shape his family. And now he's used those same principles to build this wonderful, amazing company. And in the summer of 2020, he's sitting around with some of his other retired Marines, and they're on a Zoom call, and they're talking about the things that are happening in the country. And he says, I'm so glad we never had to deal with these things in the Corps. And one of his fellow Marines says, what do you mean? And he says, well, in the Corps, it didn't matter what color you were. All that mattered we were brothers and we had each other's backs. And one of the Marines said, you might not remember because it wasn't directed towards you, but we definitely dealt with these things. You may not remember some of the names that we were called during boot camp. You may not remember how some of us were treated differently. And they went on to share experience after experience after experience. And it's starting to come back to his memory. And he says to me, Jamad, how could I have been so blind? And what do I do? And I said, you recognize that the Corps still had value and still has value for you. It was a wonderful piece of your life. As you mentioned, it's helped you build this strong foundation for your family. It's helped you build this wonderful foundation for your own life and for the company. And you can also recognize that it's not perfect. See, right now, there seems to be a narrative going around that if you find any flaws with anything, then it means that you find no value in it. And if you find any flaws in America, then you should pack up and leave. And if you find any flaws in the education system, then you're not fit to be an educator. And the truth is, folks, we can hold both, value and flawed. And what I find is that people who often hold both, they fight the hardest to continue perfecting the system. So same questions that I asked you before, based off of those last four, which lens is speaking to you the most, and or which one is challenging you the most? As you continue to reflect on those, again, you'll have access to these both end lenses. And we want you to Utilize these as you move through. There'll be times where you'll need to come back to responsible, not my fault. There'll be times where you'll need to come back to difference and sameness and be able to think through both of those lenses. There'll be a ton of times where you'll be thinking about intent and impact, individual and group, challenge and support, valued and flawed. And again, as you hold both of those, remember to hold those for yourself as well. Meaning another both and lens I'm throwing in as a bonus. You can be passionate. You can be all in. You can be truly, truly, truly mission driven. And at the same time, have some blind spots, which is why we continue engaging in this work and educating one another and doing this work in community, because both of those can be true. I'll see you later. Thank you.